Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this advanced CTE webinar, Valuing Individuals' Career-Ready Competencies Through Skills-Based Hiring. My name is Candace Williams, and I'm a Senior Research Associate here at Advanced CTE, and I will be your moderator today. This webinar is part of an ongoing series that focuses on practical examples of the CTE without limits principles and action steps in order to support CTE leaders in implementation. Principle 4, each learner's skills are counted, valued, and portable, instructs us to expand skills-based hiring practices that value competencies. This session will be recorded and shared on the Advanced CTE website for your future reference. If you have any questions at any time, we encourage you to submit them via the Q&A box on your screen, and you're also welcome to contribute to the conversation by typing into the chat box. With that, let's go ahead and get started. We'll begin with a definition of skills-based hiring. Skills-based hiring is a practice that evaluates employees and job candidates based on their skill sets instead of their educational credentials exclusively. It's an emerging practice growing in response to degree inflation, tightness in the labor market, and a desire to see more diversity in pools of job candidates. Opportunity at Work found that up to 30 million American workers have the skills to earn up to 70% more in pay, but they don't know that they qualify for roles or they don't have the required credentials, even if their skills match the job requirements. Meanwhile, MC Burningglass has found that degree requirements are shifting most in middle skill job postings, which could lead to 1.4 million jobs that no longer require a college degree. Many private companies, particularly those in the IT sector, have adopted skills-based hiring, including IBM, Accenture, Apple, and Google, and more. And increasingly, we see skills-based hiring practices moving forward in the public sphere. In his State of the Union address, President Biden announced that his administration will explore and invest in hiring based on skills rather than qualifications alone through, for example, increasing hiring of individuals who have completed registered apprenticeships. Additionally, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan recently announced the elimination of four-year degree requirements from thousands of state jobs. CTE learners are uniquely positioned to participate in skills-based hiring. In October of last year, Advanced CTE released findings from a survey of employers, which showed that 55% of employers rate job-specific and soft skills as very important when hiring a recent high school or college graduate. Only 33% of employers rated academic degrees as very important. Relatedly, 77% of employers reported hiring an employee in part because of their CTE experience, stating that they were more likely to be matched with job-ready, skilled candidates. Successful implementation of skills-based hiring requires a multi-pronged approach from employers, individuals, education and training providers, and policymakers. Employers must assess the skills and competencies that current employees hold, identify skills gaps, and clearly communicate core competencies of occupations in job postings. Individuals need to understand and articulate their own skill sets to current and prospective employers. Education and training providers can aid in this process by moving away from measuring learning in seat time and credit hours and toward mastered competencies. And finally, policymakers can play a pivotal role in setting a vision for skills-based hiring and fostering partnerships among stakeholders. From this webinar, we hope you'll have a better understanding of the value of skills-based hiring initiatives in promoting equitable economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, key action steps to jumpstart a skills-based hiring initiative, and the distinct roles and responsibilities of stakeholders to ensure these initiatives are implemented in effective and sustained ways. Joining me in this conversation today are H.L. Baird, the statewide work-based learning liaison for the Oklahoma Department of Career and Technology Education. He's a native son of Northwest Oklahoma and an educator with more than 27 years of experience working at the Oklahoma Department of Career and Technology Education. Jacob Vigil, the Senior Manager for Employer Initiatives at the Rework America Alliance, a Marco initiative. Jacob leads a team that's working to bring the future of skills to the future of work to create a more equitable and sustainable economy for all. And Mary Wright, Manager of Apprenticeship at the SHRM Foundation, who directs the U.S. Department of Labor funded HR Registered Apprenticeship Program, the first national HR apprenticeship program. With that, let's get into our discussion. Jacob, the Marco Foundation's Rework America Alliance has been supporting states to adopt skills-based hiring practices for a few years now. Can you tell us what's behind the foundation's investment in skills-based hiring?
Sure. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you, Candace and Advanced CTE, for having myself and asking Marco to present today. So I just want to say that and appreciate the invite. But with that, as many employers struggle to find workers to fill open roles, at Marco, we're working to provide more visibility for the millions of talented workers who continue to be overlooked. When looking to fill jobs, employers are overlooking people who don't have that 4-year degree, who would otherwise actually be an asset to their workforce by bringing capabilities built through those alternative pathways. For example, 2/3 of the US workers don't have a bachelor's degree. That's a huge sector of our workforce to ignore by adding in a job description that requires a 4-year degree when it's not actually necessary to be successful in the role. With that being said, we understand that there are jobs where you can't eliminate a degree from the job description, such as a doctor, right? We need them to go through years of schooling, training before they become licensed. But if you really think about it, the design of medical school is very skills-based. Students need 8 years of hands-on training, which is meant to provide them with skills necessary to do that job. Very competency and skills-based, right? So we aren't saying we're against college degrees or 4-year bachelor's degrees. We're simply saying that there are many ways to acquire the skills necessary to be successful in a particular role, and that those pathways should be recognized, such as I know a lot of us on the call today are from CTE programs. So which those CTE programs are inherently designed to provide students with the exact skills necessary to acquire a job in that particular field. So to address these challenges, we formed the Rework America Alliance, which is a unique collaboration that brings employers together with civil rights groups, workforce leaders, labor unions, and educators, all working to help the millions of people from low-wage roles move into better jobs. We're working to open opportunities for those who don't have a bachelor's degree, particularly women and people of color, to unlock the potential of all of these workers. And we're working to help employers change the way they hire and promote so that they can bring more diversity into their workforce and expand their talent pipeline. Skills-based practices are the core part of this work, because they can help open access to jobs and career progressions for millions of people who may otherwise be overlooked or screened out. So by focusing on competencies and skills, we're focusing on the ability someone has and those which are needed to be successful in a role. I'll stop there because I could keep going.
Thanks, Jacob. We'll come back to more of your insights. Mary, we know that skills-based hiring requires employers to substantially shift their hiring practices, which can take a lot of resources to train HR professionals, evaluate employee skills, change the way job descriptions are written, etc. Can you tell us what's the business case for adopting skills-based hiring?
Again, thank you for having all of us on the panel today. This is quite a great opportunity for all of us to share a number of things that we're all working on. And I know that it sounds like there are lots of people on the call today. So glad that you could be with us today. So the question around the business case for alternative credentials, I think we have to sort of begin to say very beginning is that doing skills-based hiring is good HR practices. So the list of things that you were mentioning that might have to change in order to do skills-based hiring more effective. the way that SHRM looks at this is that it really is around making sure that you're doing great HR. So that's the first thing that I would sort of say. But I think second thing I would say is that one of the things is that we have to really look at what is the landscape, what is actually happening. And I'm going to sort of go through a couple of some research here, some data that we got from a survey that SHRM recently did around alternative credentials. And so I would start with the notion of just that alternative credentials are in the marketplace. I mean, we can't put that cat back in the bag, right? It's already out there. And as you can see here, half of US workers say they have some sort of alternative credentials. And those people who don't, well, they're planning and think they might get one. So for HR professionals, for the business case, we know that this is the way that workers are trying to signal what it is that they know how to do. So it's already out there. So go to the next slide, though. Also, I think in terms of saying, well, gee, are they out in the marketplace? We know that employers are saying that they have applicants who have these credentials. So you can see this is quite high, whether you're talking about executives, supervisors, or HR professionals. So we know that folks are, employers are seeing these alternative credentials. So they need to be included as folks are thinking about how to hire their current workforce, or for that matter, how to advance the existing workforce. Go to the next slide, please. I think the other thing is when we think about something that employers are particularly concerned about today, it has to do with their diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility options, or their goals. We know that people are saying that they think that looking at those alternative credentials are certainly going to improve their efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and certainly allow them perhaps to hire more diverse candidates. So here is a significant business case around why it is that folks would think this is really important to look at alternative credentials. And so we'll look at one more slide here, and that is the fact that people who are in the workplace also believe that alternative credentials are going to help them get a new job or help them get hired for a new job. So we know that both the workers are demonstrating this as something that they want employers to look at. We know that employers are saying that perhaps those alternative credentials will help them expand their labor pool. And we know that there are a lot of credentials out there. But perhaps the biggest thing from the business case, as I said earlier, is that looking at alternative credentials really is good HR practices. So for those particularly for those of us at SHRM, as we're trying to be sure that our members have the tools they need to perform their job more effectively, we would say looking at those alternative credentials really is key for them to be able to perform their duties most effectively. Thanks, Candace. That's my thoughts.
Thanks, Mary. HL, we see that Oklahoma Career Tech has invested in some CTE power plays to help learners participate in work-based learning and attain career-connected skills in high school, for example. How can skills-based hiring further ease career transitions for CTE learners in Oklahoma?
Well, I'd like to express my thanks too for the opportunity. In Oklahoma, we decided that we've done work-based learning for years. It's nothing new. What we needed to do was get better at it in some places. The skills-based hiring really is a trend that has kind of come to a point in time where it's got a moniker or a title now. So it's existed for a while, but it is gaining speed, and we wanted to impact that through work-based learning. We know there's some major gains from getting a student connected in a guided transition from school into the employer. So some of the major things that we have done is engage the child labor laws, for one thing. The employers got to get closer to the actual schools. And part of the things that they had was confusion about whether they could engage some of our younger students. So we did a lot of research on getting child labor laws into kind of a lay term where they could understand that even though many occupations say that a student has to be 18 years of age to be in their place of employment, there are exceptions to federal labor laws for those programs that are accredited CTE programs. So we wanted to capitalize on that. Another thing that we found that when employers were asked to participate in work-based learning, liability was often identified reason why they wouldn't. So I'm a big fan of looking over the fence and seeing what other folks are doing that works. And we saw that Ohio and Kentucky were partnering with some staffing agencies. And so we had a relationship with Express Employment Professionals, and we've created a partnership with them. Now, what that does for employers is the Express company is the employer of record, and therefore they take on all the liability, all the unemployment risks, all those things that typically come into the conversation. And so I would offer to the good folks listening in on this webinar that if you have staffing agencies out there that are willing to get involved, it's a great way to connect with employers that have concerns about liability. And then the last thing that we really did was we're partnering with a platform. We've hired a platform to create a work-based learning management system. So if you're going to ask the employers to get involved with work-based learning, you need to make it as simple as possible and engaging as possible, but not so laborious. So one a couple of key things, and I know our time is short, but we require the platform to help the employer, the school, and the student/guardian create a set of learning objectives. And then once those learning objectives are created, they're automatically imported into a rubric. And now the employer communicates back with the school and the student/guardian. And we have identified things that are going to occur. We also found that in Oklahoma that when we put everything in OJT, it becomes a catch-all. So we require them to put it down into a specific set of learning skills and an internship. And so the platform on the, another thing we're going to gain from the platform is it's going to give us the data on the backside and tells us where our trends are, where places we can improve. So we're doing work-based learning. We're getting very purposeful about it, and be happy to share with anybody on the webinar what we're doing a little more in detail should they want to. Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's useful that you've identified some barriers that prevent students from participating in work-based learning, which is really a stepping stone to them getting the career-connected education that employers would value and hopefully hire for through a skills-based hiring initiative. Mary, can you talk to us a little bit more about what employers are looking for in education partners to make skills-based hiring initiatives successful?
I think that the same survey that I talked about earlier, we did a survey this past year that was of hiring managers, hiring managers, HR managers, and senior executives, and we're asking them about their thoughts on alternative credentials. And we were pleased with the numbers. We think it's statistically, significant in terms of the number of responses we got. And although people were saying that they really liked, they saw that there was value in alternative credentials, and to that point earlier, that they could see that it would help them with their diversity initiatives, and perhaps and they certainly thought it periodically. They said, people were, they were just as great performers. So there was lots of good positive stuff around alternative credentials. But there were a couple of things that made it hard, though, particularly for HR professionals. And that's really where, where the rubber meets the road in terms of, hiring someone. The issue that HR professionals had was not being sure how those credentials, quote unquote, were created. Did that credential come off the back of a cereal box, or did it actually come from a company or an organization that had credibility? And even if it had, even if it was one with credibility and it was a vendor, I'll call it that, a provider that they were familiar with, they still wanted to understand, was that a credential that required an exam? Did it require hands-on learning? Did it require, what kind of time was required in order to get this kind of credential? So there was a lot of sense around, that transparency, like where did this come from? How good is it? How replicable is it? So I think the other thing is Are there a number of certainly, are there a number of people who have that credential that we can see has really been able to demonstrate their skill sets over time? We're fighting up against a thing where employers for so long have said, I want somebody with a 4-year degree. I know what that means, right? I understand a 4-year degree means this to me. And I understand that work experience, X number of years of work experience means this. But they're having difficulty, and I can understand this, sort of figuring out how do you translate that skill, that credential into the equivalent of that 4-year degree. So we remember a number of years ago, we sort of began talking about, not everyone had to come from Harvard, right? We could start saying, well, gee, if we understand really what's happening at these state schools or local colleges, we could understand this is what this means, and we can begin to get more comfortable. But that same thing has not happened yet for a lot of employers when I start talking about the skills, the credential. So I think that's, I think, a big issue for them, and sort of how is it that they understand where this comes from? And I don't blame them. They're making a commitment to hiring someone, and they want to understand, well, do they really have the skill, and how is that demonstrated? What does that really mean? So I think that that's a big issue for them. So I think as a CTE educator, and sort of thinking about, quote, your product is having to be sold to 2 different people, both to the learner. So the learner has to understand, if I complete this credential, complete this program of study, what does that give me? But how do you send that message also to the employer? And how is it that you make that employer comfortable with a standard or a credential with which they are not that familiar? So we certainly saw that as a big issue. I think the other issue we found was that there were the applicant tracking systems, right? How people are sorted when they come through the organization or come into the organization, was a lot of those applicant tracking systems weren't picking up credentials. Just wasn't showing up. And that's not necessarily because the people who run the applicant tracking systems are nasty people and, whatever. It's that the employer hasn't asked for that, hasn't said, gee, I need to be sure I'm picking up all this information. Or it could just be that, actually no one's really thought about it much. So I think that's the other thing that we have to think when we're talking about employers. It's also the resources that they're using, and how do we make those more effective? So I think it's the transparency around the credential, and what does it really mean, and how do you help an employer take what they are used to and make it something they can be comfortable with.
Great thoughts, thank you. Jacob, hearing these insights from Mary and from HL, knowing that you are helping to stand up initiatives in other states, what promising practices from these insights are resonating with you for scaling skills-based hiring on a statewide basis, or even more broadly?
Sure. I think, hearing everything Mary and HL said, one of our key priorities at Markle is to scale, right? Is to scale skills-based practices across the nation in order to create that more equitable labor market. We're doing this in a few ways. One example is through our Rework America State Network, right, which was formed in 2018. It's a nonpartisan collaboration with 30 state governors and the mayor of DC, working to unlock that economic mobility for all US workers, right? The state network provides a forum for governors and their senior teams to share innovative workforce practices, tools, data, resources, in order to transform that labor market at scale and a pace not possible through individual state actions. So I think that's one way. In the state network elevates practices that states can adopt to achieve their workforce goals and leverage skills-based practices. So resources and tools developed by the Alliance are shared with those state members. I think one other thing that resonates, and I should have brought this up before, but I worked in CTE and I've worked in workforce. I worked for a local area technical college and ran their career services for 5 years. So all the work that I do, I have that lens from working in the CTE program. And one of the other things that we do at Markle is we really work with training providers, right? And we try to connect employers with training providers. Everything Mary said is, almost dead on with how we think of it as well. And so our goal is to really connect employers with training providers so that those training providers can gain those those learnings and that knowledge from the CTE provider, from the credential provider, where they say, okay, your program is offering these outcomes. As an employer, they can go and meet with them and say, here's what we're looking for in this role. So Markle takes on a role of really connecting training providers with employers as well, at that local level, so that they can begin to make those connections, right? So when an auto tech company comes to, a local area technical college, they can start talking about, here's what we need. And the CTE program is a great opportunity for an employer to do that work, because the CTE program can adapt. They might not be able to adapt within a month or two, but they can start to work with those employers to make those changes in the program so that they begin to build that talent pipeline for those employers. And then that can be replicated across other employers. So those are just a few things we're doing at Markle, that resonated with the scalability. One other thing was we've actually partnered with Oklahoma's governor and their workforce board. 2 years ago, we launched what we call the Skillful Talent Series across Oklahoma. And we trained local workforce boards and regions, their business development reps, their business development representatives, anyone who worked directly with employers, on how to help employers, one, learn what skills-based practices are, but two, how do they actually help an employer adopt these practices, right? You have these learnings. Now, how do you actually implement these changes within your company? And so we've worked with Oklahoma to train multiple, what we call trainers, across the state of Oklahoma in multiple regions. And it's actually been very successful over the last 2 years, which is hard to do during COVID times when we were shut down. So those are just a few things that we're doing to think about scaling skills-based practices across the US.
Awesome. And great segue to my next question for HL, which is, can you tell us some other ways, to Mary's point about trusting the credential, the skill, the vehicle for articulating the skill, for example, can you talk about some other ways that Oklahoma Career Tech seeks to build its relationships with employers and develop that trust in the skills that CTE learners are obtaining?
Well, we have several different ways that we do that. And I agree with Mary that trust is a huge piece, and it's them understanding what it is and what it isn't. And so one of the ways that we want to do that is through work-based learning. The closer we get the employer to the school and more we get them involved in it, the more they learn about what that credential is and what it isn't. They knew what degrees were, and quite frankly, it was the easy answer. If I just put down bachelor's degree required, I assumed that they could work within the confines of a system. They would finish what they're doing. It was boot camp with a degree. They knew that they could do it. Well, when we go down, and quite frankly, employers don't have the time to wait on education to get to the skill sets that they need. If you look at the timeline on the relevance of skills nowadays, a 4-year degree, by the time a person enrolls in it and graduates, the shelf life is already half used up. Okay, so if we can get these employers closer to the school and get them involved and have them involved in actually doing the work-based learning, the school knows what's relevant and right now because they're connected to the employer, and the employers learn what this certification really means. Okay, so they got to get a little bit more intimate about it. That's how you build trust, is when they have a clear vision of what you're doing and you do it like the way you're saying it. We thought years ago that when the NCCR certification came out, it was going to fix our world. In other words, there were national entity created construction certifications, and it was going to be great. And we put in Oklahoma tons of NCCR certified programs, only to find out that probably, just a complete guess, 10% of the companies in Oklahoma, mostly the largest construction companies, really cared about NCCR certification. So getting them closer to the school and the education that's occurring and making them a part of the education process is one of the ways that we do it. And then in the Oklahoma Department of Career Tech, we have a pretty robust system where we do our certifications, where we define whether it's just an end of instruction written test or whether it's a test where they have to be proctored by a third party, whether it has a skills piece in it. And we identify all those things, because what you don't want to do is have something that says, this is a certified student, and the certification for this student is an A&P certification, which requires 18 months of training and a very intense test at the end, and say it equates to a person that has an OSHA certification. Those are two different things. And so we have a system that whenever if they wish to, they can go to our website and find out what the criteria is for taking that test and getting that credential. So
Awesome.
thank you.
Couldn't agree more with all of your points, that transparency around what's within a credential is super important, as well as building the relationship with employers through very intentional practices and processes. So I'm going to have each of the panelists share a closing thought with us before we dive into all of your questions. Thanks so much for popping those into the Q&A box and also the chat. So each of the panelists, can you please impart one piece of advice that you'd give to a state CTE leader who would like to launch or get involved with a skills-based hiring initiative? What first step should they take?
Candace, I'll go first. That's fine. I think some of them have been listed here. I mean, in terms of, obviously getting as close to the employer as possible. Employers are desperate for talent. I mean, that's something we know. They are desperate for this talent. So I think so understanding that they are looking for solutions, so give them a solution. I mean, I think that's the thing, is how can you give them a solution for their talent needs? We're certainly, we're trying to help in all ways we can as the HR, membership association, trying to help them, giving them tools to help them figure out better ways to find talent. So then it's, give them a solution, but it also means you're going to have to be, and I know this keeps you up at night, I know, is how do you get enough students through your program to deliver all the talent that these employers really want. And so, we sort of get back to the thing that I always wonder is we've been able to convince, Americans to buy plug-in air fresheners in 65 different scents, but we can't get parents to think it's a good idea to send their kids to CTE programs. So I think that marketing piece around that the career and technical education is a fabulous opportunity to make great things happen for the learners and the community, I think is a really big thing. So I know I've said two things. I've gone over my question, but it really is creating that supply and then answering the demand of the employers. And so then we can solve world hunger next too. But those would be the things that I would suggest.
I would back up Marianne saying that be solutions based. There's some changes going on in the world now. And part of it is convincing some employers, not all employers, a lot of them have really got this, that the days of passive recruitment are over. You can no longer hang out your shingle and say we're hiring and the floodgates are going to come running and the phone's going to start ringing. It's a different world now. In fact, I would say that those companies that don't take workforce development and talent acquisition as seriously as they do the raw materials, if they're a manufacturer, they're not going to be a company that's around in 5 to 10 years. This is a new world. And so, Mary, I love it. Be solutions based. Look at what's out there. Look at your area and your community. What are the skills that are needed there? And are you meeting that? And then the last thing that I would say is one of my favorite quotes of all time is from Einstein. And it is, our world is a product of our thinking. In order to change our world, we have to change the way we think. So as CTE educators and leaders, can we change the way we do things just a little bit and impact more students. I can't answer what that is for your community, but I know that we've learned from the pandemic that we can share information, the cognitive side of things. We can do a lot more without ever going to the school. So is there another process that you can use to impact more people, provide more training, more skills development without the standard one that we had going into the pandemic? So that would be my piece.
Awesome. Wow, you all took multiple talking points that I was going to use for that. So I think what I'm going to do, I'll actually zoom out. You all did a great job, and I agree 100% with both of you. You were zoomed in. I'll take the opportunity to zoom out and focus on what we've learned at Markle on working with CTE leaders at the state level. And honestly, what I can say is find internal champions or advocates. We call them champions at Markle that really want to help you lead this change, right? So zooming out, thinking before we get into all the brass tacks of find champions, find your other state leaders who you can get bought into skills-based practices, right? Because when you have people bought in, it's a lot easier for this to be scaled across your CTE programs, your state, your governor's office. We actually, in Colorado, one of the things we learned is when the governor and the head of the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment really championed skills-based practices, it tended to be a trickle effect with other state departments. Even the 4-year college is really looking at how can we start thinking about our programs and redesigning their online programs and so on. So I would say, really look at finding champions, both high level, mid level, and, the people doing all the work on the ground, working with employers to champion this work. Once you have those champions, it becomes a lot easier to, gain the access, the resources, to be able to deploy these at a very scalable level and strategically, right? And then build community networks with employer groups. More zooming in now, build those networks with those employer groups so that when they do meet with your students, and basically everything that, HL just talked about is, they understand your programs a lot better.
Great thoughts, everyone. So now we'll turn to our Q&A box, and we'll try to get through at least one or two of these. I want to start with India's question, which has to do with why HR professionals would translate the skill or the credential into the equivalent of a 4-year degree, and why not translate that skill directly to the job description instead. So I think the question is about what's the value of that alternative credential in brokering the translation? And maybe Mary, you want to take that one first.
Sure. I think some of it is the fact that some of it is I think the point made earlier about that we have a standard by which we have done things. We've had a funnel by which we have sorted people historically. So we have said this particular role needs a 4-year degree, and there's all these assumptions that are made about the skill sets which a 4-year degree holder arrives with. And I think that, to then take that assumption and move to something where now I really do have to categorize or list everything that I think I'm expecting this person to know. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that HR professionals are lazy or any of those things. That's not the point. The point is that this has been an assumption that we've made, and we're now having to shift. And shifting from one to the other is always a challenge, and it's time consuming. And it also requires a hiring manager as well to step back and say, well, what is it that I'm really hiring for, right? We've there are lots of job descriptions which say, great in communications. Well, the kind of communications you want from a retail worker is very different from the kind of communications you want for someone who's on a machine shop floor. Completely different, yet we have always said communication, that's great. So I think it's just that we're having to rethink the way that we write job descriptions, the way we describe job competencies. And so it is having to, it's having to really change the way we describe what it is we want that person to do. So I think it's a shift, and I suspect my colleagues have seen this slowly happening. Easier to do also in certain job titles. Certainly there was a comment earlier about IT, that really IT was getting far better at this. And I think that's correct. They've done because they've really said, I need somebody who can do this kind of programming or whatever, and I need it today. And I don't need somebody who does that other kind of programming at all. So, and that's been, I think, easier than some of them, even more sophisticated knowledge worker jobs where we're saying, well, we need somebody who, again, can communicate, whatever that means. That was a long answer, but I think I think that's really what we're trying to say.
Well, to another question here in the Q&A box, increasingly the tools to communicate these skills from an education and training provider to an individual to an employer are within a digital ecosystem. And it can be hard for educators, workforce, and employer partners to jump on board with these emerging tools. Do each of you have some thoughts about how to make the case for engaging in a new sort of technology solution? HL, maybe your work-based learning platform comes into play here, but any other thoughts on that?
Well, really, the platform we're looking at is to connect the skills. The student looks for an employer based on a cluster, a career, a pathway, and hopefully they end up in an employer. The employer looks for skills back down, and hopefully they find a student. That part's really fairly easy. The connecting, it's ones and zeros. The hard part is figuring out to what degree you want to aggregate that information. Because if you get so granular and you talk about SMAW welding in this particular environment, you get a lot of related skills that you lose, that you could connect with a person that has a lot of skills that you could use. So I think what I'm saying is it's a lot of work to go from just saying a bachelor's degree gives me all that I need, and that's good to know. There's work to find out what is the right level of skills identification you want to do. For us right now, we're kind of looking at program level. It's manufacturing for welding, that sort of thing. We can go in and do all those granular pieces, but we've yet to learn if that becomes just a bridge too far and it becomes the opposite of what we want, to be able to find more people, bachelor's degree versus courses, or where it gets too finite and we lose people from trying to have such an exact search. Don't know if I answered the question, sorry.
Thanks, HL. Mary, Jacob, any thoughts on the digital ecosystem?
I guess I would say I think we're about to see the end of those people who spend a great deal of time revising resumes. I think, because I think we're saying, that was a great thing, and it was a way to deal with it. But now, as I said something about applicant tracking systems, right? There's all that research that says those resumes aren't being viewed correctly. So I think that this whole idea of the digital wallets of the skill sets, it's coming. And I'm sure Marco's looking at this as well as we are in terms of what's going to be the right way to do it. I think there's lots of issues around access and equity and all those other issues that always happen when stuff moves to technology based. But I think it's coming, and it's just a matter of then figuring out how all the employers, how that gets, how those are analyzed, how they're utilized. Lots of questions there, but I think it's coming.
Yeah, I agree. At Marco, we've focused over the last 10 or 15 years on the digital skills divide, right? And how do we get workers to get more training on digital skills? Digital skills is a very broad term as well, right? That could simply mean, how do I utilize a computer, right? How do I utilize Excel, all the way to how do I operate CNC machinery. So, we definitely have a strong focus on making sure people do have the right skills, digital skills coming into the new age of technology, and just really focus on that, and not necessarily on a specific digital skill, right? Because all of them will be important, but we don't want, whether it's an employer or a job seeker, to get stuck on, I need this one specific digital skill. It's more broadly used term that we utilize to, help employers think about all digital skills and how they can either provide training or seek out training providers who are providing those skills.
Definitely. Well said. So I feel as though I must apologize to the attendees. We are at time, but you all have populated the chat and the Q&A box with a lot of great questions, which means that we probably should do another webinar in the future on skills-based practices. So stay tuned for that. We really appreciate you joining us. When we end the webinar, there will be a quick evaluation that will pop up on your browser, and we would really appreciate if you would share any feedback you have about this webinar. A recording of the webinar will be posted to the website. The materials, the resources cited will be shared with attendees via email as well. And we do have another webinar coming up on April 27th on learner-centered models for building integrated state career advising systems. So we hope that you will join us for that. But please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with further questions, and we so appreciate you joining us. And thank you very much to the speakers who shared some really thoughtful insights with all of us today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Candace.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.